you have a strong opinion on this topic that you over and over say, like, well, I need to think about this, or I haven't thought about this much, or let me think about this for a little bit. Um, Whereas these are questions that I've been going over for years and have been talking about for years and have been studying for years. And uh, when other people who don't have any knowledge on these topics are running around telling all of the people who have a lot of knowledge on the topic that they're wrong, this is kind of how we end up with like Nazis and all sorts of conspiracy theorists and people like that.
Are you
Because
fucking serious?
yes, I'm dead
So,
serious.
so you're just gonna basically say my behavior is what leads to Nazis. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Politics on Twitch, analysis, other various things.
Okay. How long have you been streaming for?
I think it's in totality. I think it's going on 3 years. But I had switched accounts midway through building up my other account because I felt like I wanted to branch out more. Because before I was just doing like Clone Hero stuff, where I was just playing, basically Rock Band.
You
But
say
I
you
wanted to
changed
expand out.
accounts. You mean you like rebranded?
I didn't rebrand. I just switched my account because I felt like the audience I had gained through streaming Clone Hero wasn't the audience that would stay for like the politics stuff.
Mm. Yeah, I've always thought about how Destiny went from just playing video games to then all of a sudden he decides to start talking about politics and somehow didn't lose like 90% of his audience.
To be fair, a lot of his audience was really reactionary. Um, and so when he did talk about politics, it was is usually like really spicy, so they like that type of stuff.
So, are you do you consider yourself like fairly far left? Are you a socialist or
Yeah, Ancom generally.
ANCOM? Okay. Okay. Um so you had a conversation with Hans.
I'm gonna stop it here. I'm gonna go and I'm gonna reflect and talk with people
Absolute
and
fucking thank you.
reflect on
Fine.
my
Get your
positions.
dumb ass out of here. You literally are talking all this shit, and you come on. You can't fucking defend any of your fucking shit because you haven't fucking thought it through. I
Oh,
have. My position is
oh,
completely fucking consistent. And I will argue for the rights of fucking trans people. And you are fucking pathetic that you will literally harass me for fucking months with this shit. Come on, get basic fucking questions that you probably haven't even thought about because you're in your fucking basic ass bitch Twitter bubble, and you can't fucking answer them. So you sit silently. You can't reframe the question. Now you're just gonna fucking dip. Yeah, fucking run away because you can't defend your dumb shit ideology. I'm really fucking sorry. I'm gonna be here, fucking based as fuck, arguing for the rights of fucking trans people because people who are trans cannot choose not to be trans. Have a good one, buddy.
yeah,
Fucking
yeah. Me,
Christ.
me, me admitting that I need to think more about it is totally an own. Okay,
So true.
like, yeah, okay, buddy.
Go read more theory. Have a good night. All right.
And you had
Mhm.
posted on Twitter and said you didn't feel like you did too well and felt like you could have made your points better. Um, I was interested to talk to you anyways, but I would also like to know what all points you felt you could have made better. And like gender is something that I have been studying linguistically for years. And um, I guess I before I talk for too long, I guess that a lot of like Hans's takes are missing some pieces as well, and it seems as though he didn't. I from my point of view, he didn't do a great job explaining his points either. So um, I felt like it would be better to just talk to you myself instead of watching that debate and try and figure out what either one of you believed from it.
Yeah,
So-
generally, some of those statements I made were made under the like assumption of like the conflation between gender identity and like an expression as well as like transness. So I said, you know, transness is a choice for some trans people because, you know, they choose to either go away from the binary or et cetera, et cetera. And to an extent that's true, but I don't think transness in and of itself is a choice, but expression and how you express that transness is.
Yeah, you were right about one part where you were saying that he was conflating gender identity with was it
He was
gender?
No, he was conflating transness with gender dysphoria, and that's a lot. That's a mistake a lot of people make, and he kept doing it over and over, and I kept having to correct him.
That's
I'm like,
true.
no,
He was
no,
doing that
you-
as well, but there was something that I didn't feel like that's what you called him out on. Maybe you did that as well, but I remember you saying that he was conflating gender identity with gender presentation, I think is what it was, or something like that. And
no, it was definitely gender dysphoria and transness. I kept telling him, you know, you don't have to have dysphoria to be trans, and that, you know, just
yeah,
because
that's
some
definitely true. That's
Yeah.
right. You did mention that a bunch, and yeah, he was definitely doing that because he kept acting like if you're trans, then you automatically have to have this like
Yeah, he kept saying that people with gender dysphoria could just stop having gender dysphoria and be whatever gender they want if gender is arbitrary and like
Right.
and you can choose to be trans or whatever. And I was like, no, that's not how that works. That's not how we've, you know, come to know what gender dysphoria is and the results of it.
Right. Well, and so when it comes to being trans, you would say that being trans is somebody who identifies with a different gender than the one they were assigned at birth, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm only asking this because somebody mentioned this to me the other day and said that this is something that's like becoming more and more popular, and they asked me to talk to a couple of people about it, and I had never heard of it, so I went and looked it up, and apparently it's true. There are a lot of people who are identifying as a cis non-binary person, but unless they were assigned non-binary at birth, they couldn't be cis, because cis just means you identify with the gender that you were assigned at birth. So like it doesn't make sense, but apparently yeah, there's like a large amount of people identifying as cis non-binary people. So I guess that's good.
I feel like
We agree on
I
that.
think that's the nomenclature there is a bit off, at least in terms of how I understand the terms. But I can understand the sentiment because I'm someone that's like fine with being perceived as a guy, but I don't feel particularly strongly about being a guy. Like like it just it doesn't really factor into a lot of the decisions I make a lot of the time. There may be some subconscious things that like I'm not cool with due to like, you know, that sort of like masculine posturing, but like other than that I don't really care.
I mean, I think
And so
most
I can
people, unless you're trans or unless you have some sort of gender dysphoria, I think that most people don't really care, but it will be like for the most part a subconscious thing where you're making decisions. You're not making like a conscious decision to think like, oh, when I walk into the clothes store, I need to go to the men's section. Like, no, you just kind of do that automatically because that's how you were raised, or that's like where the types of clothes that you like are. And you're not thinking, I'm doing this because I want something that's masculine or I want to present as masculine. It's just kind of like, I don't want to say subconscious, but it's just kind of like following the motions at that point.
I wouldn't say it's subconscious either because I know there have been like moments where I deliberately go to like the men's section and stuff like that because I'm like, oh well, you know, women's clothes are for women. But to me the notion now is kind of silly and it's just like wear whatever.
Mhm.
Um But yeah, I think like the cis non-binary stuff, I think they're kind of being confusing. I think they should be a little more clear and just say they're non-binary. Because it's fine to be non-binary. Like I feel like those people are still are like trying to like enter the non-binary space without feeling like they're intrusive to you know non-binary people and because you know a lot of non-binary people will have well not I wouldn't say a lot but like some non-binary people will have dysphoria and like have you know the sort of trouble with basically separating themselves from the binary and being able to like be okay with how they present and that's sort of where I come from because I feel like I could be somewhat non-binary, but I also don't feel comfortable sort of like being in that space and being considered that because I feel like I lack that distinctive like sort of drive or at least like you know conflict and I know it's not a requirement for anyone to be non-binary. It's just like that sort of like imposter syndrome type thing where you're just like, do you know, do I really fit in here?
So, what is it specifically that you felt like you didn't get across very well in the Hans debate?
I feel like I could have better described how XenoGenders are trying to shape their language and how they're arriving at their you know gender identity. And I figured out a way to describe it in that when we say I'm a man or I'm a woman, typically people mean completely different things when they say those things. And they may mean something generally the same, but there are still nuances and particulars to them that they feel, you know, they're a woman in that respect or they're a man in that respect. Because there are plenty of women that will consider themselves women but present very masculine. Or they're men that are just like I'm a dude, but I
I'm
dress
sorry,
up in
real
skirts
quick.
and stuff. And
Do you have something clicking in the background?
oh yeah, it's probably my fans. Sorry about that.
Okay. Sorry, go ahead.
But they generally people mean very different things, and it's always very personal to them. And you know, xenogenders are the same way. They have these particular ways of identifying. They just want to find language to express that and find language that better suits their experience of gender rather than just man or woman because a lot of times man or woman have those expectations of you know specific traits and they want to move away from that. They want a new system, a new language to be able to describe what it means to experience gender through their lens.
Sure. Yeah, I've talked to a number of people who are xenogender, and that's close to how they would describe it. And so Hans's problem was that he felt as though this hurts the discourse for trans people, and that like it's hard to advocate for trans people if we just keep making this category more and more confusing, right?
Yeah, so he's basically of the mind that like at a certain point neopronouns and stuff like that will basically just be you know nicknames. And just basically saying that it would make the language around gender clunky, but a lot of language is already clunky. A lot of language is already like foreign to other people within the same language. Like you talk to someone that's not on Twitch and you see poggers and shit like that, they're not gonna know what the fuck you're talking about.
Yeah.
And so this whole argument from utility in terms of language, I think is kind of silly because language all the time has like really weird rules and really weird, you know, functions. Because language is not perfect. And he also said that like if you can be metaphorically like a deer and in the same way a trans woman is actually trans, you're basically saying that that woman that trans woman is metaphorically a woman. And to that I would say everyone's metaphorically a man or woman. Everyone. there's no set standard for what is a man or what is a woman. It is arbitrary. There's no such thing as the man or the woman that you can point to at all.
Okay.
Unless you think sex equals gender.
Right.
But we all know that that's not always correct, and that's not a good determiner of gender.
So the way that we understand gender is that gender is like a spectrum between femininity and masculinity. We have like a middle group where, so if you land on like the feminine side, we'll call you a woman. If you land on the masculine side, we'll call you a man. And then if you're very close to the middle, to where you're just like a beautiful amalgamation of masculine and feminine characteristics and traits, then we would call you non-binary, normally because it's hard to place you on one side or the other, and normally those people don't feel comfortable enough identifying themselves with one gender or the other within the binary. So they'd rather just identify with the middle. And we use this language to identify certain types of people or certain characteristics, but more so we're identifying an entire concept. So like that, lots of times when people talk about gender, they're talking about, they'll use like a chair as an example. Have you heard this before? Where they'll say you can't, like a chair in and of itself is a concept. You can't just give like a definition of a chair and people will know what it is, because then you'll end up with all sorts of other things. We could say like 4 legs, a back, and arms, and it's something you sit on. But then like, well, maybe a couch is a chair now. Maybe a bench is a chair, or maybe like, what is or isn't a chair. So normally we use
a rock can be a chair
exactly,
because you can just sit on it. Yeah.
Right. So now we have to use like more of a concept that has all sorts of different characteristics, the way that it looks, the way that we use it. Because if it's like in a museum behind like tape and stuff, well, you're not going to sit on this. Maybe it's a piece of art. Maybe it's not a chair, right? Like we can't define things that rigidly. So we have to use what's called a kind of like a prototype theory, where we have a prototype in our heads of what something is supposed to look like. And we all know what a chair looks like. And the farther away you get from that, the less of a chair it becomes. But we can look at something like a computer chair and see, well, it has 8 legs. It has wheels on it. It can recline. They come in all these weird shapes. Like, that doesn't look like a chair, but in our heads, it's close enough to our prototype of a chair to where we would still call it a chair and not call it a couch or not call it a bench or whatever else. And so it's the same with genders normally, is they fit some sort of concept in our head where we have a prototype of what a woman is supposed to look like. And this is going to be the most feminine thing ever, like a 50s style housewife with long hair, makeup, heels, a dress.
But the problem is, like, what do we consider feminine? And
that's what I'm saying.
How do we... Yeah, it becomes, it becomes very dicey when you try to get that definition of, well, what is feminine, what is masculine.
Because you can't have a definition. That's exactly what I'm saying, is you can't have a definition, but we do have a prototype. You can't have a definition of a chair, but nobody's going to say that chairs don't exist, right? Or that we should just get rid of the concept of chairs because we can't have a rigid definition. But obviously, we still have an idea that we all share, because as humans, we recognize patterns. We see things in the world, and over time, we recognize patterns, and we categorize those in our brains. And so with the word gender, or with the word masculine or feminine, or man or woman, we've categorized these in our heads, and we know what is closer to feminine, to the most feminine thing, and what's farther away from that. We can all agree on these things because we all have a prototype of what that's supposed to look like. That doesn't make it objective. It's still like I said, it's not rigid. It still has like fuzzy edges to the concept, to where like some things may or may not fit, and we'll start to have arguments over it and stuff like that. Just like with a sandwich, like we can look at like a hot dog and say, well, maybe that's a sandwich. I don't know. Like we can start to have arguments over what is or isn't feminine, what is or isn't masculine. But it doesn't mean that all of a sudden, because we don't have an exact definition, that the categorization just ceases to exist, right?
True, but I would argue that the role that gender plays within our society is kind of useless. Because like what is the point of delineating between man or woman beyond maybe like medical stuff? And even then we would just use sex in terms of like male or female. Like I don't understand why language and why, you know, expectations of people should require that distinction between man, you know, masculine or feminine.
Well, so okay, so you agree that like the term like masculinity, like or the gender, it kind of correlates with sex, right? Like it's not the same exact thing, but we've come up with these concepts based on what are expectations of a male, right?
Sure.
Okay, so some things that men do or within the concept is based on actual biology, right? So like men have different brains, they have testosterone, they have things that make them act differently, have different interests, care about different things, makes their brain waves light up in different places for different sorts of things.
I don't agree with that. I think a lot of what makes a human up is more nurture rather than nature.
Well, no, it's not one or the other. Yeah, it's both. But what I'm saying is that this is actually part of what makes something like masculine, or what like males are more likely to like these things. It's not 100%, it's not every time, but in generalities, it is more likely that men will like certain things because we know their brains react differently and are stimulated from different types of things.
But is it due to biology or is it due more to sociology? Because
it's both.
Back in I disagree. I think what men gravitate towards has way more to do with sociology than it does biology, because of how we develop as humans. Because back in the day, you know, men had a propensity of like raping. Well, no, that's probably not a good example because we still do that a lot. Like there are certain behaviors we could see that are like sort of eked out of society due to social changes and to changes in how we bring people up and how we develop as humans. So I don't think there are specific ways in which we act or like preferences we have that are inherently biological.
That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying inherently biological. Again, I'm talking in broad generalities to say that these things are more likely. So we know that like men's brains are more likely to light up in certain areas when it comes to some sort of like action or movement, like involvement in things, whereas female brains are more likely to light up when it comes to like some sort of emotion or interaction with them. So like boys, like they have a bunch of studies done on kids or babies within the first 6 months that they were born, where it shows that like boys' brains will light up when you like wave your hands around, you make a bunch of goofy faces, like certain parts of their brain will light up and they'll laugh and they'll be more interested in stuff like that. Whereas girls, they care more about like you looking at them, you touching them, you having some sort of interaction with them. This is in the first 6 months. Like this isn't like nobody's like socialized them. They haven't like been hanging out at the babies club enough to where they thought, well, this is what'll get me in with all the cool kids, right?
Well, the thing is that there's a lot of psychological data to suggest that a lot of subconscious and preferences are developed within the first few years of life. Like,
that's true. Yes.
Yeah, and like people who have fathers that have anger problems will develop anger problems later in life, not because it's biologically passed on, but because they experienced those behaviors while they were super young and absorbed that into their own behaviors.
Yes.
So
Again, we can't say something's biologically passed on, though, because you keep like narrowing it down to as if I'm saying this is just biology, and that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that we become more likely to inherit these traits, or more likely to what do you call it, like to have these characteristics if we are a male or a female. But this actually correlates with trans people, where they have similar brains to the people, or to the gender identity that they identify with. They will have woman brains, or like gendered brains, that have similar brain waves in the same way, and brain size and brain construction. And then even if they start taking things like testosterone or estrogen, like these sorts of things affect them also in the sorts of things that they might like, the ways that they act, the emotions that they have, like all sorts of stuff like that. Like all I'm saying is that our biology plays a big part in our gender expression and the way that other people are going to view us, but it's not all of it. It's like obviously, like the social constructs, society, like all of these things play a huge part in it as well. And for those, like, we definitely want to make it to where people are free and able to do whatever they want, but we can't ignore that, like, some people are just going to be more likely to want to watch sports because there's a lot of action and a lot of movement and a lot of things that men just generally like.
That's the part I disagree with, though. Like, I don't think that men have a propensity towards that because of biology. I think it mainly has to do with sociology.
So what makes you think that then? Do you disagree with all of the studies? Like, what is it about the science behind this that you think is wrong?
Because I don't think that you can necessarily point to like this gene or this, like, you know, specific thing leads to people to enjoy sports more. I don't think that that necessarily tracks with the studies done. I don't think it would even really be possible to do that. Like,
genes wouldn't have anything to do with it. Like I said, so men and women have completely different brains. You know this, right? Like, not completely different, but we have very different brains in the brain construction. We have different brain waves and like areas that light up in certain instances, and we have different brain sizes. Like, you understand that those three things differ from males and females. So it doesn't have to be a gene. But also on top of that,
how do we know that these functions in the brain didn't develop due to sociological things happening?
Because we're born with
in
them.
their childhood. Yes, but sociological things that happen to someone can affect how their brain functions.
Before we're born?
No, but like, well, I'm not sure of that.
That's the part that I'm confused about. I keep saying, like, we're born this way. Like, we have these when we're born, or even before we're born, and somehow this is, like, I don't want to act like you to think that I'm disagreeing that sociology plays a big part in these things, and our brains are going to develop in completely different ways depending on our surroundings as we grow up. But to completely discount that part altogether wholesale means that you're missing a massive part of the puzzle.
I don't know. I just think that we should just let people do whatever the fuck they want. And
I agree.
Not give a fuck.
I agree with that. Like I said, I think that we should definitely be open to people being able to do what they want and acting how they want and those sorts of things. But if we, like, when we talk about whether or not gender is like without purpose, or like it's random, I forget the word that you were using.
Arbitrary?
Yes, if we're acting as though it's arbitrary, like, it is arbitrary in a lot of ways, but it's not completely arbitrary. There are some things to where we know that these things correlate at high rates, and that includes trans people. These are some of the things that like seem to be most validating to trans people, is the fact that there was science to back up the fact that they actually were very feminine inherently, like they were and when it comes to what gender dysphoria is, this is someone who has a woman's brain in a man's body. Like, well, what is a woman's brain then? Are we going to pretend that a woman's brain doesn't exist? Because if that's the case, we're going to pretend that gender dysphoria doesn't exist, right?
I don't think that follows.
How so?
I don't think saying that like so you can say trans people exist without having some sort of like
now you're doing
medical. What are you talking about?
I said gender dysphoria. Not you said trans people.
Okay, so people can have gender dysphoria without having to narrow it down to the brain being biologically female or what the fuck ever. Like we clearly have other means of like verifying that they exist and that their dysphoria is emergent from their upbringing.
So I'm interested, what do you think gender dysphoria is then?
That's hard to define because
it's a medical term though. Like it's easily defined.
I wouldn't say easily defined, but it's definitely because it's very complicated. But my broader point is that I don't see how distinguishing between masculine and feminine really helps our society or provides any utility. And even if you can make the argument about, male brains versus female brains, you can just make the distinction of male or female. You don't have to tie the male or female to masculine or feminine.
Well, if it actually... So when we say male or female, we're more so talking about... it could be gametes, it could be chromosomes, it could be private parts, however you want to define sex, like that's fine. But those things don't actually play into masculinity or femininity, like chromosomes, gametes, and private parts. Those things have absolutely nothing to do with whether or not you're masculine or feminine. And so when we talk about what is masculine or feminine, these again are just patterns that we've observed over time and then categorized and given words to describe what it is that we see. To say, I don't know what the point in having a tree is. Like, why do we even call it a tree? It's just there. It's going to be there, like, whatever. Just let it be there. It's like, wait, but like we see them.
That's describing that's describing something in the world. What I'm saying is that having gendered expectations doesn't necessarily serve society in a positive way.
And I agree with that.
So I think we should get rid of them and do our best to not project, these expectations onto other people.
Well, you see, you're putting something else in there that's not actually part of your problem. You're saying you don't like gendered expectations. So now let's just get rid of gender altogether. Well, that gender existing isn't your problem. It's the gendered expectations. Like, we should allow people to act however they want.
But gender wouldn't necessarily exist without gendered expectations.
Sure. So if we have a bunch of dads who are forcing their sons to play football, and we think that that's kind of messed up, their sons shouldn't have to be forced to play football. Should we get rid of football, or should we tell dads to stop forcing their kids to play football?
I feel like that's completely different because, as I said, gender expectations are what drive gender and what construct gender.
Sure. So is football. Football, if we didn't have football anymore, dads couldn't force their kids to play football.
I feel like this is not analogous at all.
Are you able to explain how it's not?
Yeah, as I said before, gender is an emergent property of gendered expectations, and I don't think that gender expectations are healthy for society, and so we should get rid of gendered expectations, which would then get rid of gender.
I mean, in sociology, they don't think that gender is like completely from gendered expectations. Do you know? Is there anywhere that you can anything that you can like send me that would say that gender is completely from gendered expectations? Or like, I feel like
Well, why
this is a
else would we why else would we seek these things out and identify with them if they're not expectations from society?
well. I mean, there's a lot of that's like a very complicated question. There's a lot of reasons for that. In general, we gravitate towards people who are more like us, who look like us, who hopefully we can identify with. When males and females are going to have different interests over time, they're going to act differently and like present in different ways to separate themselves from each other, and then each one will gravitate towards other people with similar interests and act similar to them, and will
Well,
bond over those things by looking like each other and acting like each other.
my point generally being is that gendered expectations is what informs gender and how we talk about gender. If we didn't expect men to act a specific way, then we wouldn't even necessarily have the gender of men, because we wouldn't have language to describe that and to
I know,
and to
I know you keep saying that, but I keep asking, like, uh, again, in sociology, that like I there's nothing that I've ever seen say this. Like the only person I've ever heard say this before is Demon Mama, and I've asked for sources. I've searched far and wide for sources that say this. I have never found anything that says anything like that. In academia, that just doesn't exist when it comes to gender. Like there's a million reasons for why gender exists, but it by itself, because of gender expectations, there's absolutely nothing that suggests that that's the case.
so then what do you think gender stems from?
Like I said, I mean, so in general, it's like tribalism is part of it. So like I explained earlier, us gravitating towards people who we identify with and who we feel more comfortable around, is one part of it. Some of it is just like consumerism and sales and the way that certain things have been advertised to certain groups. Some of it is expectations and what it is that we expect from certain people who we categorize in certain ways. There's a million reasons for it, and one of them is that we also have like males and females have had different biology, and so would most likely have different interests and care about different things. But my overall point is that, like, just because it's more likely for somebody to care about something else and have a different interest, that doesn't mean that we should expect them to have that interest or want them to have that interest. And so, therefore, we can have gender, we can have, men and women, but we don't need to like push people to fit into these bubbles. And I think right now we're heading in the right direction. We're like, for the most part, we're allowing people to present the way that they want and identify the way that they want.
Well, so. My thing is, I think gender is an emergent property of identity that comes about from the expectations that society puts forth, and is basically a reaction to that. And I think getting rid of those expectations will, at the very least, alleviate a lot of the pressure people feel about gender presentation and how they interact.
But where does that idea come from?
What do you mean?
Like, where do you get this from that these are like based on expectations? Like, did you
Because
just think
I
this
don't
up
see.
one night while laying in
Well,
bed and
well, I
thought,
don't.
well, I'll go tell everybody this is what it is now?
I don't see how we could have gender without the constructs of men and women that we already have. I don't see how um you could have gender without the language to describe it, and without specific definitions or general archetypes.
Yeah, but we talked about this earlier. You saying that it like people wouldn't be more likely to be pushed into a certain category doesn't mean that all of a sudden abolishing that category is the answer. Just like anything else in the world, we don't do that. We don't say if a dad wants his kids to play football, we get rid of playing football. We just tell the dad to stop pressuring his kids into playing football. And in general, we should stop we should get people to stop pressuring people into certain categories. We can't say,
But
well,
the
if
thing
football
is I
didn't
don't think
exist, you wouldn't
I
be
don't
able to
think
pressure them into it.
well the thing is I don't think gender exists in the same way that football does.
So, explain.
The way we describe and interact with gender currently is a mix of self identity and the expectations put on us by society, and I don't see how gender would exist when the expectations from society cease to exist as well. I don't see how you could still have men, women, and et cetera when we don't have when we no longer expect or have these archetypes pushed onto people.
So, I'm having a little bit of frustration here. I keep asking why you think it is gender identity or society that like forces gender on people, and why gender wouldn't exist without these things. You don't have an answer for any of those things, but you'll still say, well, this is what I think. And I'm trying to find out why you think that and how you're getting to that conclusion. But you aren't giving me any answers when it comes to that. Now, when it comes to gender, I studied this for a long time, and I have most of my mods are and a large part of my community is trans, and I talk to them and try to like understand their uh, their experiences with these things so that I can better understand what it is that I'm learning in these other areas. Um, but to when I explain gender, I can explain like how this came about, how it's looked over time, how it's changed over history, why it is that we act a certain way, why it is we look a certain way, like all of these things. And I explained most of this in the beginning, but I haven't, you're saying that I'm wrong, but you haven't given any sort of explanation to why it is the way that you say it is. And I'm trying my best to understand and like get to a point where I can get some information or some like some line of logic that led you to this conclusion, and that's what I'm trying to get at.
I mean, I'm trying to think through it myself.
Yeah.
Because I just because my thing is like I keep saying, I don't see how a society without those types of archetypes would have something we could call gender, and I'm trying to figure out how to explain why.
Okay. Well, we can move on because I also wanted to talk about xenogender.
Mm-hmm.
Because I again, I don't have a problem with xenogender or like people identifying however they want, right? I want people to
Right.
be as free and able to identify however they want and do whatever it is that they want to do in life. I don't want there to be some sort of barriers for them in these things. But when it comes to gender, if we're talking about like a spectrum from masculine to feminine, and even let's say it's all just one big social construct that doesn't map onto anything, and we just like somebody just decided to make it up one day. Okay, so even if that was the case, we would still have like these patterns over time that we've identified, and we say like, okay, like this is what we normally see as feminine, and this is normally what we see as masculine. There isn't like a spot on those. I'm sorry, is somebody snoring?
Yeah. Sorry about that.
It's okay. There isn't a spot on the spectrum that we can find and say like this is where the concept of like cuttlefish would go, or like the spot where like bear would go, or something like that. And I think that those identities are completely valid, and that like if they have some sort of like pronoun that goes with it, like I will respect that. I don't have any issue with that. My issue is acting as though it is on the spectrum, or that it like aligns with gender and then attaching it to gender, when it can be an identity that is fully valid in and of itself, but acting like it's gender now makes it sound like you identify with something different than what you were assigned at birth. So now you're trans because you identify with a bear, but this group of trans people have specifically been undermined and subjugated for a very long time throughout history, and we give them special treatment because of that, to try to change the way that society has treated them, to try to like bring them up to make them more equal. And now there's these other groups who are saying, hey, we also want special treatment. We also want all of the like small pieces of benefits that come with being trans, but we don't want any of the like bad parts of being trans. And so we're just going to attach ourselves to this bandwagon and get those benefits, and attach ourselves to this movement that seems to be successful and making a lot of headway, and use it for our thing too, that has nothing to do with their thing. Does that make sense?
Not really. Like I don't see how XenoGenders are like trying to like come in and just be like, oh, the trans community, yeah, that was successful at, you know, gaining acceptance. Let's just do that and call ourselves bear gender. I don't think that's the case at all. I think
I'm not
that
saying that they made up their identities and they're just calling themselves bear gender. But do you agree that, okay, so we already agreed on what it means to be trans. So what makes somebody who identifies with a bear, because I'm only saying bear because I never met anybody who identifies with a bear, and I don't want to use a specific person as an example, so I'm trying to use something as an example that won't actually sound like I'm like using a certain person for this. But if they identify with a bear, what is it that makes them trans now?
because they're breaking away from the gender binary, because xenogender is a form of non-binary, and using new language to explore what their gender means to them.
So if we say gender is masculinity and femininity, and you identify as a bear, are you no longer masculine or feminine?
I don't think that masculinity and femininity are these unchanging facts of humanity.
Of course.
So I don't think that you have to have that like spectrum to talk about gender necessarily.
Well, wait, if that's how, if gender is defined as a spectrum from masculine to feminine, then what else would we use to talk about it?
I'm not sure. I think that's the point of xenogender is to break free of that and try to find other ways of identifying with like gender expression and how they present themselves.
The thing is, though, is that they would still end up somewhere on that spectrum. But the bear thing would be as valid as it is, just on a different spectrum or in a different category.
But the thing is that is that spectrum good a good way of defining how people want to identify or how people would like to be perceived?
Yeah. I mean, for like 99% of the world, yeah. It seems to work. Did I lose you?
I'm just thinking.
Mm-hmm. Because I don't want it to sound like I'm against, gender people or their pronouns or their identities, because I'm not. But I feel like it would almost be like me as a football fan going over to hockey players and being like, "Hey, I'm a huge hockey fan." And they're like, "Who's your favorite team?" And I'm like, "I'm a fan of the Atlanta Falcons." And they're like, "No, we're talking about a hockey team." And I'm like, "Yeah, the Atlanta Falcons." They're like, "Wait, but that's a football team. That's not a hockey team." It's like bare identity can be valid and exist all on its own, and that's perfectly cool. But it's not gender. And so when we look at what gender is in that spectrum, in the way that it works, in the way that people identify, we can like stretch this and try to make it to work for as many people as possible. But that doesn't mean that all of a sudden we're going to add things onto that categorization that aren't actually in that category. So we can have another category that is another type of identity, that is animals or inanimate objects that people can identify with, and it's, again, perfectly valid and something that we can all respect, and it can come with all sorts of different pronouns and stuff like that, and it's perfectly fine. But when we attach that to gender and we say, now these people are also trans, but they haven't been oppressed, there's nobody trying to keep them from existing, they're not being killed at high rates, they're not being locked up, their parents aren't.
You keep bringing this up as if you're morally scolding them.
No, I'm not morally scolding them.
Yes, you are. Then why bring this up?
Because it's a confusion in the way that people like you describe gender, to where they can feel as though their movement is attached to another movement that isn't actually attached to. And so, again, we do give trans people special treatment. I grew up my entire life calling my little brothers my little sisters, and it was funny. And they called me their big sister, and we all loved it, and it was funny, and we had a good laugh about it. If they were trans, I could not do that, because I treat people who are trans a little bit differently than I treat people who are not trans. There's a special treatment that comes along with that, and misgendering them is just one thing among many. It's a treatment that I give to trans people that I do not give to everybody else. And if all of a sudden other people are coming up with these other identities that are not trans, but they're identifying it as trans to get these special treatments, I suppose, yes, it would.
Yeah.
Be a moral
Okay. Yeah.
scolding.
You're definitely morally scolding.
Yeah, sure.
Trying to say that they're trying to get these special protections. What the fuck are you talking about? Right now,
What part of what I said do you
more...
disagree with?
Hold on. No. Hold on. Xenogenders right now, even on the left, are more maligned in terms of that trying to get their identities to be recognized by the broader left than trans people are. And I'm not saying I'm not doing oppression Olympics here, but they are definitely getting pushback on us through similar argumentation than non-binary people were getting 5 years ago. So this moral grandstanding saying that they're coming in and getting special protections and shit like that is fucking disgusting.
They are, though.
They're not.
They're not. It's not. We agreed on the definition of trans. If you'd like to, at some point, explain your positions at any point during this entire conversation, the floor is yours, buddy. But I have explained my logic through these positions. And if you disagree with any of my logic, I'm happy to hear it. But you're not disagreeing with my logic or any of the things that I'm saying at any point. But you are proposing a completely different way of thinking that does not have any line of logic behind it. I'm happy to hear your side if there is a side to hear. I think you're probably right. I probably am. Would you say morally scolding them? Yeah.
Yes.
In some way, yes. I don't think they're doing it on purpose. But I think that if people don't know what gender is or what trans people are, then yeah, there's going to be a lot of confusion in these movements in the ways that they work. Just like if we started saying that it was fine to be like transracial, which I'm not saying transracialism is like compared to transgender whatsoever. But if we started saying like, yeah, transracialism is fine, and now a bunch of white people say, okay, well then I identify as black, and then they carry that oppression with them.
The difference there is that race isn't an emergent property of identity and is something that is imposed on people to other them.
Right. And if somebody started identifying as
I love you, Tom.
As a black person and started trying to carry that oppression with them, saying, well, because
are you seriously describing XenoGenders as transracial people?
No, I just said that I wasn't doing that. I'm using a hypothetical. Are you following me?
No, you're using this to make an analogy.
Right, correct.
Yes, so you're comparing, being xenogender to being transracial.
Yes, I said I am comparing them. You asked me if I was saying that xenogender people are transracial people. No, I'm not doing that. I am comparing them to make an analogy.
I would say you're wrong in that case because gender has a lot more to do with self-identity than the
right. That's not the part that I'm comparing though. I'm comparing the oppression that comes with a certain title and the treatment that we give those people. If white people start identifying as black people and now say, now I get this special treatment with identifying as black, there would be something wrong with that, right?
Yes, but race is completely separate from gender, and I don't.
Hold on, do you not understand analogies and hypotheticals?
Oh no, I understand the analogy, and I don't think it's correct because I don't think xenogender people are the same as transracial people. I don't think that they're coming in to be like, oh well, now we're trans, so we're oppressed. And I honestly find that position to be fucking disgusting.
Okay, so if somebody comes in and says, hey, I identify as this this bear, and I have this bra and bro gender or pronouns that I want you to identify me with, and I don't identify with them with those pronouns. For other people who are not trans, there's not a big deal made out of whether or not you do or don't identify them with their preferred pronouns. But there is with trans people because there's a special exception to doing that. Now, if I say, as a trans person, you now have to respect my pronouns, or you're being transphobic, and you're going to be labeled as transphobic because you refuse to respect a trans person's pronouns, do you not understand what that would be doing exactly what you just said that they're not doing?
I don't think so, because I think xenogenders are just a branch of trans people. They're a form of non-binary.
Well, yeah, most of them are likely to be non-binary. Yeah.
And you would agree non-binary people are trans, right?
Yeah, of course. They identify as a different gender than the one they were assigned at birth.
So again, I don't think that the transracial analogy really works here.
Do you think that being non-binary is a gender in and of itself?
Not necessarily. I think
Yeah, I
I think it is a form of gender expression.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. So it would be weird if we all of a sudden started sectioning off a thing that isn't necessarily a gender, but would be like a form of gender expression. But we're saying, hey, now we're going to section off this thing.
I don't think they're sectioning off. They're just using language to describe how they experience their non-binariness, or at
But
least
didn't
their
you just say
their
that xenogender is a type of non-binary?
yeah.
Wouldn't that be the same thing as a section? Or like a different categorization?
No, because a non-binary can be used as an umbrella term.
Right? An umbrella
And
term for
and
different
yeah,
sorts
for
of
different yeah,
categorizations.
yeah, like xenogenders.
Right. So that would be
I
sectioning
don't
them off or categorizing them differently.
yeah, I don't think that's necessarily a problem.
I wasn't saying that that in and of itself was a problem.
I love you, Tom.
I'm sorry. This is the problem that I run into on a consistent basis, is that like we have reasons for these things. We have words for these things. There are people who have dedicated a lot of time to understanding them and studying them.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are people online who don't seem to have done any research into these topics and have any understanding of them, but they will walk around talking about them as though they have and as though they do understand them, and it makes it really hard to explain these sorts of things or get people, because
This gender fucking sucks.
Well, why does gender suck?
Because I don't think it's a useful categorization for people. I don't think it has any use beyond, maybe being a little more specific in terms of like describing someone's appearance. I don't think it serves any utility. I think it puts toxic expectations on people.
But again, it seems to work for like most of society, right? Like that's normally how social constructs are built, is like they don't even have to be something that works for like 100% of society. Normally it's just the larger portion of society uses a term and finds utility in it.
But what I'm saying is that I find it useless. I don't find it particularly useful when talking about people.
And this is the point. Yes, exactly. And so you should have the freedom to express yourself however you want. And that is like where the problem lies, is the expectations. we can keep gender. Gender can't necessarily go away because it is a pattern that we've recognized. The spectrum is there. We can see it. We can recognize when somebody is on one side or the other.
But the thing is when I talk about gender expectations, I also mean like the spectrum that we talk about between masculine and feminine. I don't think those types of things are useful necessarily.
I understand that you're including that, but my point is that, again, like, if these are just patterns that we've recognized over time and categorized them in this way, if all of a sudden we start using other things for expression and identity, whether or not those other expressions are feminine or masculine, or whether or not those people seem more feminine or masculine, will still be there. Like, it'll still be like that categorization and that way of looking at people will still be there. And just like saying, I don't like that categorization doesn't do anything to the categorization. Like, it's still patterns that are there and are observable, right?
But I think that moving society away from looking at that and from using it in our language and describing it would then make pointing it out useless. Like, even if the supposed patterns exist, people not caring about it and not willing to point it out or like expect things from it, then it would just not really exist anymore as like a concept or like a function.
Yeah, I don't think that that's true. I don't think that it would just cease to exist if we started ignoring it. Like, we've categorized it for a reason, because these are patterns that we can observe. If all of a sudden we stop observing them, they don't cease to exist. Like, they're
I'm
still
not saying
there.
cease observing them, cease to acknowledge them as present, because it just doesn't matter to broader society. I don't think gender really matters all that much. I think it should just, be a vestigial thing that just wears away over time.
Okay. I don't expect everybody to be experts or like have done a ton of research into this stuff. So I don't it's not as if everybody should understand these things at all times, right? But and this seemed to be Hans's big problem at the end of your conversation, is that he felt like he was being scolded by somebody who didn't really have an opinion on the topic. They just were repeating things that they had heard other people say, and they felt like it sounded good, so they could go scold him for being the bad one in this discourse. And I can't help but feel the same way, as though I not that you scolded me or anything, but that you have a strong opinion on this topic that you over and over say, like, well, I need to think about this, or I haven't thought about this much, or let me think about this for a little bit. Whereas these are questions that I've been going over for years and have been talking about for years and have been studying for years. And when other people who don't have any knowledge on these topics are running around telling all of the people who have a lot of knowledge on the topic that they're wrong, this is kind of how we end up with like Nazis and all sorts of conspiracy theorists and people like that.
Are you fucking serious?
Yes, I'm dead serious.
So you're just gonna basically say my behavior is what leads to Nazis? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I can not take you seriously ever again. Cool. Bye.
He really doesn't have a way to argue against anything. Like, he could have said, well, no, I'm nothing like a Nazi for this reason, and this reason. He could have said, well, no, you're wrong because of blah, blah, blah. He could have said, like, well, here's some information that disagrees with all of the information that you're giving me. At literally any point during this entire conversation, he could have given me something that disagrees with me. And I was literally getting ready to steelman his position and give him at least some information and some facts and some arguments that would help him strengthen his argument, so that hopefully he could take that and go research from there and go like start finding information from there. Me explaining that people who don't understand a topic or who don't care to actually research a topic, but running around with strong opinions on it anyways, and just like making up some sort of, some sort of like narrative in their head that they think, well, that sounds good to me, so why don't I just go tell everybody this is the thing? Like that literally, yes, that is how we end up with like Nazis and conspiracy theorists and all sorts of stuff, is that it's misinformed or ill-informed people acting as though they understand something and then running around talking about it as though they understand it very well, and using language and using language to talk about things as though they could be an authority on the topic, or as though they've done a minimal amount of research on it. And yeah, non-binary simply means identifying outside of the traditional male/female binary. I'm so confused. Well, okay, so again, this is the way that it's explained, and this is the way that every non-binary person that I've ever spoken to about it says that they would describe it, and this is the way that my buddy Rob's textbooks explain it, is that if we understand masculinity and femininity on a spectrum from like left to right, okay, and there's like a middle spot where like you're going to have, because like a whether or not you align with one gender or the other is going to be like an amalgamation of thousands of characteristics and thousands of different things, to where like we'll have an overall concept to where we can place you somewhere. But people who are really close to the middle are people that visibly we wouldn't be able to categorize as one side or the other, and they don't feel comfortable identifying as one side or the other. So non-binary means that they identify with the middle, that they don't identify with one or the other, which is what makes them non-binary, is that they're not one or the other. It's not non-gender. Like if gender is masculinity and femininity, they're not non-gender. No, they still have masculine and feminine traits. They still have a lot of things that are masculine and feminine, both. So they end up in the middle of the spectrum, not off the spectrum. Then there's not another spectrum. Everybody's on the spectrum. Everybody has gender. Like, it's not as though you're non-binary and so you just don't have gender. Like, no, you're in the middle of the spectrum. Did you see Xander Hall and Hans debate this, Tom? Oh, it was so bad. It was so bad. I saw Xander Hall and I've talked to Hans about this stuff a bunch, and I never heard him talk much about it at all. And then recently he started talking about it, and I felt like he was doing a good job. The LeftistOwl part, I felt like there was a lot of spots that he was missing and a lot of like areas that he could have done better on. And then Hunter and Xander Hall talked about it, and that was just out of this world. Like, none of that made sense from either one of them. I had no clue what they were talking about. Excuse me. No clue what they were talking about that entire time. Like, again, it sounded like they were just making stuff up. Yes, Bob Lova on the spectrum. I know. Imagine baiting autism jokes. uh, this freaking